This really does have to be seen to be believed. This is a Tory MP, Vicky Ford, a former investment banker, who's represented the good people of Chelmsford since 2017. Let's have a listen.
Okay, but there are jobs out there caused by global pressures, and actually the UK is better off in our growth numbers than France, Germany, Italy, USA, Canada, Japan.
Right.
Do you want me to continue?
We're going to show, just before we let you go, this graph, which actually stands in stark contrast to what you've just said, Vicky Ford. Economic growth since COVID-19. I will tell you the figures of G7 countries. United States there at the top, 4.2%. United Kingdom at the very bottom, behind Canada, Italy, France, Japan and Germany at minus 0.4%. Vicky?
And the IMF is forecasting that this year we will be ahead of all the others. We have to look forward. We have to have fiscal stability in this budget.
Well, now if that were me, I'd enter a witness protection scheme, change my name, my identity, leave the country and never be heard of ever again. But not so for Vicky. No, not her vibes. She just brazened it out. She didn't even blink. She didn't even breathe. She didn't pause for breath. Straight back in on her, well, complete bull. Now, this is a useful exercise. I actually thank Vicky for her service. Well done, Vicky. You've opened up a conversation because I don't think enough attention has actually been given to how much of an economic catastrophe 12 years of Tory rule has been. Now, I say that because the Tories try and present themselves as the kind of sensible economic custodians. You know, the guys you might not like. Maybe you think they're a bit mean. God knows how you came to that conclusion. But you can trust them with the economy, with their hands on the tills, whatever sort of basic metaphors you want to shoehorn in. So let's just have a look at their actual record, the record we've had to endure for the last 12 years. The UK's had the sharpest projected decline of GDP, of its economy, so the sharpest decline projected for 2023 in the whole of Europe, and by a massive margin. No other country's even close, minus 1.4%. Now, if you look at the G7 countries, which is the UK, France, Germany, Canada, Italy, the US and Japan, the UK is the only country with negative growth in the third quarter of 2022. Now, the economy isn't projected to return to its pre-COVID level until the end of 2024, which means a whole parliament, that is since the Tories were last elected in 2019, of no growth. So that period of Tory rule, literally no growth whatsoever. The population's grown, but the size of the pie, which is not actually obviously evenly distributed, very unevenly distributed, but the size of the economy will be no bigger. Now, as The Guardian's economic correspondent Larry Elliott puts it, an entire parliament of zero growth is unprecedented in modern times. Now, let's look at some other measures, because what should really matter in terms of the economy is people's living standards. Now, if you look at real household disposable income, that's projected to fall by about 7% over the next 2 years. That's money people have to spend on themselves, on their families, on just being able to live, basic goods, all the rest of it. Now, real disposable household income in 2027-28, that financial year, is set to be lower than nearly a decade earlier and about a third below the pre-2008 trend. So a third less than should have been the case after the financial crash spurred the Tories on to become crazed pro-austerity zealots. Now, if we look at workers, so let's take out pensioners who rightly have their living standards protected. I support the triple lock, partly because, well, there's 1.9 million pensioners in poverty even now. Our state pension is not as generous as other European countries. And also, if you attack pensioners and pension provision now, that's an attack on younger people who are already getting screwed over in their younger years because they're aspirational pensioners. They want to be, hopefully, live as long enough to become pensioners. And then they'll end up with crap pensions, having had crap standard of living in their younger years. No thanks. So let's take out pensioners though. So they've suffered the longest squeeze workers in living standards since the early 19th century. So the real wages of workers, there hasn't been such a protracted squeeze since Emperor Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. Now, if we've got to put the latest Conservative budget of Jeremy Hunt in this context. This is the only major Western country that is hiking taxes and slashing spending in the midst of a recession. The worst thing you can do in a recession is those two things. It's a doom loop, because what it means is less growth, less tax receipts, and then you just end up with less money in the pot, and you're supposed to be saving that money, but you've reduced it because you've got less growth. Great. There's obviously several other horrors. I mean, I've just talked about the economy here because the Tory MPs made an absolute arse of themselves on national television. Not for the first time, won't be for the last. But we could talk about many other horrors, obviously, which are kind of linked. So under Cameron and Osborne, the longest squeeze in the NHS's budget since it was founded in 1948, leaving us monstrously unprepared for the pandemic with pretty catastrophic consequences. And now, of course, we have record waiting lists, times, and a mass staff shortage. So, great. Well done, lads. Great work. Per pupil funding in schools, lower than it was in 2010. Rampant vandalism. Just vandalising the futures of younger people, which we all depend on as a country. They've hacked away, of course, the welfare state. We've got an epic housing crisis with millions of people often trapped in a private rented sector with rip-off rents. Social housing is not there because it's been flogged off, so you're stuck on social housing waiting lists for years if you want that. Meanwhile, home ownership's become ever more unaffordable for huge numbers of people. Brilliant. Rising child poverty. Nice to drive children into insecurity and hardship. Great people. Great lads. Well done. Creaking infrastructure, not least transport. Transport in this country, particularly outside of London and the South East, there are substantially poorer countries with much better infrastructure and transport than this supposedly a wealthy country. Obviously, young people increasingly trapped in precarious and insecure work. This is a country in which the poorest have a worse standard of living than the poorest in a significantly poorer country like Slovenia. That's where we're at. Now, we could go on, but, you know, all of this, all of that, what do the Tories have to show for themselves? Because what they've done is overseen stagnation and decline in terms of the economic situation, in terms of people's living standards. And yet the country's more polarised and divided than ever. Like, they've just turned this country into a cauldron of discontent, anger and frustration. I mean, this country hasn't been more divided or polarised any time in its democratic history. It's just what they try to do, partly to deflect from their disastrous economic record, is try and start culture wars all the time. Turns out, though, you can't pay your bills with racism, and you can't pay for your kids' welfare with transphobia. These things don't pay the bills. They might distract you from your inability to pay your gas bill, or your inability to pay your rent or your mortgage. But these culture wars, like racism, like transphobia, they're not going to make your life any better, are they? Just deflecting your anger away from all the people at the top, the Tories and the economic elites they represent, who you should be angry with. So, herein lies, I think, the lesson which we've been taught by Vicky Ford, which is the Tories really have overseen an absolute social and economic catastrophe, and we should never, ever let them get away with it. Please like, subscribe, and support the channel on patreon.com/OwenJones84. I will see you soon.